So, for any of you that don't know me, my name is Landell Proctor. I work on the in-app stuff on the 15th floor, the driver framework team. So what we're going to talk about is in the summer of 2006, I set out to ride my bike roughly 10,000 miles in about 100 days around the perimeter of the U.S. So this rough map here with the blue line is not at all the route. Well, it's mostly the route that I rode, but it's not the finished product. But the reason I called the talk Managing Expectations is because basically the route was one of those things that expectation definitely got managed as the trip went on. So most people, when they find out that I did this, the first question they ask is why. I feel like I could probably do an hour-long talk on the why, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. And it actually relates to sort of some of the stuff I want to try to tie into our lives here, in a business sense. At the time, I was 24 years old. I was living in Richmond, Virginia, in my parents' house. I had graduated from college about a year before. I was working for a friend who was trying to get his small business off the ground, and he had hired me to come into his company to help out. That job was not going the way that it had been described to me. And I basically needed an exit strategy. But I was not confident enough to have a very awkward conversation with my friend to say, hey, the job that you promised me is not the one that I'm doing, and I want to leave this company. So instead, I came up with this elaborate scheme in which I knew he would not get mad at me if I said, I'm going to quit to go ride my bike around the country. There's a lot more details in there that I'll leave out for now, but basically, my inability to have a hard conversation in a lot of ways spurred on this adventure. So a lot of some general assumptions that I made about the trip. So this is 2006. The iPhone does not exist yet. It will not be around for another 18 months. Google is a resource, but it's not exactly the Google that we know today, where you just type in anything you want and there's a million responses and YouTube videos telling you exactly how to do this thing. I searched everywhere I could for information about people who had gone on long distance bike trips and what equipment I would need, how do I plan for this, and basically I came up with almost nothing. So I read a couple books. Bill Bryson, the travel writer, I read his book about his Appalachian Trail walk. It was moderately helpful. I mean, he had a backpack and I was going to be on a bike, so some of those things, we both had tents. Is basically where our cross section of common ground was there. And then I read a few other books, but nothing was really doing that. So basically, I talked to as many people as I could who had sort of if they'd done a long distance trip, and gathered what I could from them. So a few things that they told me that I immediately assumed would just absolutely be true on my trip also. One guy said, everyone will let you camp in their yard. And if they don't let you camp in their yard, you just pull off to the side of the road and camp, no big deal. So I thought, fine, I can camp. I've been camping a bunch of my life. I'll just pull off on the side of the road and camp. Check, no problem. So that planning piece was taken care of. There's a company out there called Adventure Cycling that does make these really elaborate cycling maps that you can buy that have all these different routes, and there's tons of information about parks that are useful or hotels or places to eat and things like that. For my trip around the perimeter of the U.S., that was going to cost me roughly $385 or something. I did not have $385 to spend on maps, so I bought a Rand McNally road atlas and just started highlighting state highways. And so I just made the route as best I could. I thought this would be cool. I'll go through a bunch of cities I've never seen before, and that'll be great. That turned out to also not be the best idea, but we'll talk about that a little bit down the road too. And basically, I just thought that that people would again just see me, be like, look at this kid wandering the U.S. Let's ask him what he's doing, and then they would just invite me into their homes. That kind of didn't work out either. All right, so it will go. So this is a climbing term that I think probably applies pretty well to my trip, and then also I think I try to tie it back into a lot of projects that we might do within our everyday work. So it will go is basically what mountaineers say after they've looked at a mountain that they want to climb. They do all the assessment of the risk. They decide if they've got the equipment, if they've got the crew, can we do this thing? And if the answer is yes, they don't say we will climb it. They say it will go or it won't go. So after having all those conversations with all of my friends and trying to figure out if this thing was feasible or not, I decided that this trip would go. And so on the middle of July, I set out and sort of decided to see what would happen and went out there. Oftentimes when I'm at work and we're talking about a new project and we're deciding whether like a new feature to add or whatever is going to be, like should we take on this endeavor? I think we sort of go through the same process a lot of times, and we can look at the hurdles that we see in front of us that we know are there. We can make those like risk assessments and determine whether or not like our projects will go or whether they won't go. And sometimes we say they'll go and then they don't, or sometimes we don't start something that we maybe should have because we're too afraid of the unknowns. So I try to like remember this trip. There was a lot of unknowns. It worked out okay. I'm still here talking to you guys, so it didn't go that terribly. But so that's what I like to do when trying to assess whether or not a project or a feature is sort of like worth tackling. So one of the things that I really had to do was use the resources that I had for this trip. So like I said previously, I did not want to spend $385 on maps. And so everything in this picture was like my full setup for this trip. So this bike I got from a friend. He had it like laying around and he said, hey, I don't like that frame that much, but I think it would be great for your needs. Do you want it? I said, sure. So this trailer is called a bob trailer. It hooks right onto the rear axle of the wheel. That was a friend's too. And he said, I've got this bob trailer hanging in my garage. Like, what's your plan for like carrying stuff? And I said, I don't know. And he said, you should take the bob trailer. So I took the bob trailer. So the yellow bag is basically like it's like a scuba bag that's basically a dry bag, so you can roll it down and it's completely waterproof. So this is actually like the trimmed down version of all of the crap that I had on there originally. My first day, it was piled with like, I don't have a picture of it, but it's piled with like lots of stuff, and the center of gravity was all wobbly. And the first 45 miles of the trip, I was sure I was going to die. And I pulled over into a McDonald's parking lot, and I called my mom, and I said, I'm done. Like, trip's over. I can't do it. Like, I haven't eaten or drinking anything for 45 miles because I'm afraid to take my hands off the handlebars. You have to come, like, get me. And so my mom talked me off the ledge, and she said, well, is there stuff that you could, like, leave out? And I said, well, I don't know. Like, I put everything in the floor, and it all seemed absolutely necessary. So I'm sitting in a McDonald's parking lot making, like, mandatory, like, maybe and, like, can go away piles, and I'm, like, sorting through all my stuff, and I eventually, like, whittle it all down. But those resources and everything that I had available, like, I had to really take some assessments on, like, what was necessary and what wasn't. This also reminds me of another story. So I was by myself, and I'm, like, carrying all my junk. And I'm in Montana, and so I'm heading, like, due west, and there's just, like, this crazy, like, I don't know, very windy headwind coming right at me all day. I had to pedal to go downhill, which just seemed, like, unfair. I was cursing the like long distance bike touring gods, whoever they might be, repeatedly throughout the day. And I'm sitting on like, I'm exhausted. Like, it's flat eastern Montana. There's like the scenery's not great at this point. And I'm sitting on the curb with like a gas station. I'm probably eating like a 99-cent honey bun or something. And these two guys come like riding up, and they're like just on these like super lightweight, like state-of-the-art bicycles, and they're by themselves. And I think to myself, this isn't part of the country that I assume there's a lot of like recreational cyclists. Like, I wonder what these guys are doing. So they come over and we chat, and they're like really excited about my trip. And they go, oh yeah, we're going the other way. We're like going across the country too. We're headed to Boston. I was like, well, where's like your stuff? Like, how are you going to get to Boston with like just bikes and like cycling kit? Like, oh, our wives are in the car and they've like got all of our stuff and they just go ahead and come to town. That's the appropriate response. And I was like, oh, great. I don't like either of you anymore. Please carry on. So they had their resources that they had available to them. Their experience was a lot different than mine. But they had their own experience. I'm sure they sit around water coolers and tell the tale of riding from west to east across the country. But the resources that I had was me and my bob trailer. And I think sometimes we like run into those things at work too, right? Like, we've got things, we've got projects. Sometimes we have hardware that may or may not be exactly to the specs that we want. Sometimes we might be working on a bench and we'd really like it if the radio and the Wi-Fi worked at the same time. But sometimes that doesn't happen, That's not the thing. Maybe there's another team whose radio and Wi-Fi does work at the same time. But those things, they allow us to sort of sit around and we can commiserate and we can bond and we can write, but the project still has to get done. So just like those guys kept going with their, stuff being like shepherded ahead by their wives in cars, and I kept going my way, cursing into the headwind, we both had our trips, and we both have like stories to tell from that. So the resources that you have, you can definitely like get accomplished what you need. So I don't know if the rest of you guys do, but I used to struggle to ask for help. Like all the time. Like I thought I would go on this trip, and even though my assumption was that people would like shepherd, like just like bring me into their home and let me like sleep on their yards or whatever, I still like didn't want to ask for that help. I wanted people to come up to me and just like offer it, right? So this picture is taken the first night that I did not have a friend to stay with going up the East Coast. My tent's pitched roughly like 100 feet past like a no trespassing sign on private property in New Hampshire. I like figured this part was like, okay, my first plan of action this day was like, I went into town around dinner time. I went to a diner thinking that'd be where like all the locals would be hanging out, and they would see me, ask questions, and then someone would, adopt me for the evening. That did not pan out. So I left town after eating dinner, and I was like, all right, well, I got to camp, so that's fine. Like, this is what the trip's going to be. Like, it'll be fine. So I find a spot off the highway that I think is going to be okay. I go back, I pitch my tent, I go back to the highway, can't see the tent from the road, so I'm like, okay, everything's fine and safe. So I climb in. I slept for probably 5 minutes this night. Every sound in my head was a bear that was going to attack me or the landowner who was going to shoot me. I wasn't sure which would be worse. Probably I would have taken the bear. But so I just sat there completely sleepless the entire night. The sun starts to come up, and I said, well, I guess we can get going. So I break everything down, and I get going, and so I just keep going on the next day. And as I'm riding up this like hill in New Hampshire, this car up ahead like pulls over, and I was like, I don't know how I would have pissed this guy off. I haven't done anything. I'm just like riding my bike because I'm just like assume like I'm tired, I'm exhausted. I assume this is like confrontation's gonna happen. The guy gets out of his car and he sort of like stands there and waits for me to come up, and my other instinct is like to cross the road or something so I don't have to like interact with this person. And so this gentleman, I don't remember his name. We'll call him Mr. Smith. So Mr. Smith, in college, had ridden across the country and had always vowed that if he saw someone else who appeared to be like bike touring, that he would like ask them if it made sense. He would like bring them in for the night. And this was like a few hours into my ride, and so he explains this to me. I almost immediately say yes. I don't ask where he lives, like what the logistics of getting there are. I'm like, yes, that sounds fantastic. I don't have to camp in the woods, and you probably have like a shower at your house. So he ends up. It wasn't too far out of my way. But it ended up being like just the greatest experience. I got to meet him and his wife. They had a daughter, and they really took me in. They fed me. Again, they had a shower, big plus. And it taught me the lesson that oftentimes sometimes we like need to ask for help, and then especially if help is offered, do not be too proud to accept it. I'm not sure that if I hadn't like serendipitously ran into him on the side of the road that day, I don't know that the trip would have kept going that much further, because camping on the side of the road was out as far as I was concerned. That expectation had been managed. So then these are people who I ended up like, this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but like these are people, some are friends, some are family that I obviously knew before I left, but some are just complete strangers from the trip that took me in and let me either like camp in their yard or stay on sleep in the guest bedroom, sleep on their couch. And they completely changed the way that I viewed this trip. Because instead of it being about riding my bike around the country, it really became like meeting a bunch of like interesting people from like all over the US. So it really sort of, being able to get comfortable with asking for help and then accepting the help that was offered to me really completely changed the way that I viewed this entire adventure. Micromanagers. We've all dealt with micromanagers, right? Whether that's coming from an official management position or like someone on your team. So here's a story from my trip that I had to deal with a micromanager. So it was a family that was very nice. They were going to take me in for the night, and they lived in Monterey, California. So I'd been coming down the West Coast, and so I called them when I was about an hour outside of town or so, and I said, hey, I'm getting close. Like, if you give me your address, I'll find it. And so the gentleman says, oh, there's no way you'll find the house. And I thought, look, you live in a maze? Like, I left from Richmond, Virginia. Like, I can find it. Like, I'm good at navigating at this point. But Gookie, you won't find it. So he insists that I meet him at this little intersection where there's a bike path. And so we meet there, and I think like, okay, he's gonna throw my stuff in his truck and we're gonna like drive back. Nope, he thinks it's very important that I continue to ride my bike to his house, but he's going to drive at like bike speed in the road while I'm like on the bike path, and then he'll like signal ahead and he will just like navigate me to his house in that fashion. Okay. So he micromanaged me to his home in a very like strange way. I couldn't do anything about that, right? Like I can't like, that's fine. Like this is a system that I just have to like follow. It's the one he wants to use, so we do it. We get to his house. There's lots of house rules, which I'm happy to oblige. And then he says, I bet you want to take a shower. I was like, that'd be great. So we go into the bathroom, and he explains to me that their family doesn't believe in using the cold water to cool the hot water to take a shower, that they only use the hot water to do it. Now I think to myself, that's not how plumbing works. But like, but maybe your plumbing is different and it like works for you guys. So I say, okay, I'll try it. So, you know, he leaves so I'm in the bathroom. I'm like fiddling with the hot knob, trying to somehow like I'm only getting like more and less flow. I'm not getting a different temperature. And eventually I think like, what am I doing? He's not in here. I'm all by myself. I don't have to follow this system. And so I turn on the cold water, get a perfectly comfortable temperature, take a shower, and I come out and he goes like, how'd it work? I was like, it was fantastic. Never thought to take a shower like that, but it worked out great. So in a situation where this like micromanagement couldn't actually like oversee my actual like process, I could take on and go about it however I want, right? And then in the end, he was just as happy with the result because he thinks he taught me this like great thing or that I like showered in the way that he wanted. It didn't matter. So this lesson has taught me, I fall back on these, like thinking about this gentleman all the time whenever I have sort of like interactions with micromanagement at work. Like sometimes you have to follow like whatever this micromanagement system is, like him guiding me on my bike to his house. And then sometimes he closes the door and you can do whatever system you want and then present the finished result and everyone's happy, right? So you just, you take that lesson how you want. So I really learned to make eye contact on my trip, and particularly like in one case. So I know eye contact's like super important. We all like take it for granted, but so the picture here is important too. So I had been going down the West Coast, and like on PCH1, it's basically like a comfortable like 65 degrees every day. There's an ocean breeze. It's super pleasant. So when I get to San Diego, I turn east and I start heading like into the desert, and the 65 degrees suddenly becomes like 105 degrees. It's very hot, and I have this like distance that I'm supposed to make that day, and it becomes very evident that I'm not gonna make it. Like the heat and the climbs coming out of San Diego are just like more than I was prepared for. And I call my mom sort of frantic, as like I've got probably like a couple hours till the sun goes down. There's no shot I'm gonna make where I'm supposed to go. And I say, and again, this is pre-iPhone, so I'm like, can you find a place for me to stay? Like, is there like a hotel or something? Like, I'm not feeling well, so I don't want to camp. Like, is there a hotel or something I can check into? So I sort of just like, I don't get a gas station or something, so I just like drink Gatorade. And my mom calls me back a few minutes later. She's like, I found a place for you. It's called like the Desert Oasis, like Paradise or something or another. She's like, it's down the road, whatever. So I'm like, great. So I go down and I see a little sign for something that resembles Desert Oasis or whatever I think she said. And I go in, and it's certainly a hotel, but there's like nobody there. And I'm like, hello, hello, and this like person comes out, and I was like, yeah, I think my mom just got off the phone with you. And she's like, no one called. And I'm like, great, like what do I do? She's like, oh, you want this other place? She's like, you go down the road another 2 miles. There's a dirt road to the left. You'll see a sign. You go down the dirt road. When you get there, there's a call buzzer, a call, and like they'll let you in. And I'm like, that's a weird hotel, but okay. So we, like I'm going, and I get there, and I hit the call buzzer, and they're like, oh yeah, we talked to your mom, we're expecting you. Like, I'll open the gate, just come on around. So the gate opens, and I go in, and I immediately realize why this place is so secluded from the road, as 2 naked people on a golf cart drive past me on like the perimeter road. And I've never made more eye contact in my entire life. So it was off season, so they weren't completely full, but there was still plenty of people who had decided that clothing just wasn't for them, like roaming around. So it was nude optional, so I kept my clothes on. But I went and checked in. They had like a little hotel thing like on premise, which is what like my mom had like Googled and found. So like I checked in. The lady explained like all the rules to me, which the rules were basically pretty simple. Like, take your clothes off or leave your clothes on, whatever you want. But they had internet and like these like little, they had like a Wi-Fi like, you know, enabled like computer in the lobby. So I went and like checked into my room, and then I needed to go do some like, I had to change a bunch of logistics. So I had to go back out. I couldn't just like shelter in, right? So as I'm going, there's like people in hot tubs, they're like inviting me to join. Like they were all very, very friendly, also very, very naked. And so again, eye contact was practiced throughout the time, and so that's, I mean, it's a pretty usual thing to make eye contact, but never more so than in that situation. On my trip, I learned to apologize, and it says occasionally, because it would be occasionally, but frequently enough. So you're allowed to ride your bicycle on a state highway. So you are not allowed to ride your bicycle, except in extreme circumstances, on interstates. Now, several places in the U.S. decide, relatively arbitrarily, in my opinion, to change from a highway to an interstate without really like any indication as to what you're supposed to do. And using a Rand McNally Road Atlas, I had no way of knowing this was going to happen. And so, without wanting to have to figure out a detour, I would just keep riding on the shoulder until a cop pulled me over, which happened every time. So I would get pulled over by cops, and they would say, you know, like very gruffly, like, "What are you doing?" And I would explain, and then they would be like, "Oh, that's kind of interesting." So then they would like soften up a little bit, explain to me the dangers of riding my bike on the shoulder, and I would explain to them, I don't understand what the difference is between that shoulder that I was on, like, you know, a half mile that way and the shoulder I'm on now. They're the exact same shoulder, and you know, we would get into policy debates. So this picture in particular, though, I was going into San Francisco, and as I was in Marin, which is the town just north of San Francisco, there's a bike path that you can take to avoid using the freeway that is very well hidden. The designers of this made it so that only locals could possibly find this bike path. And so I was like parked with my bike, I was at this place, there was an entrance ramp to the freeway, and it sort of worked out in the past, so I thought, all right, let's just do that. So I go riding up the shoulder onto the freeway. This was not a great idea. The shoulder becomes non-existent roughly like 2 miles later, and cars are going very fast. And so, you know, I heard the familiar, like, woo, behind me, and I thought, well, all right. So I pull over, and I'm like, well, at least he can give me directions. So these were the directions that he chose to give me. This was basically just like a horse trail that went straight up a mountain that happened to be next to where he pulled me over. And I was like, that's really the way? He's like, well, you can't go backwards. And I was like, all right. So he gave me these really rough directions to follow where I went up this horse trail. Mostly I was just like pushing the bike because I couldn't ride up it. And then I like dive bombed down this other horse trail like into the city. That's where I learned that my brakes weren't doing very well anymore. I needed to get those replaced once I got into San Francisco. But I survived. And so I get into San Francisco. Like it turned out to be an actual like fantastic experience because I was coming across the Golden Gate Bridge like as the sun was setting, and it was like really just like super picturesque. I would have like not had that same timing had I survived the interstate exchange. Although I would have had to pay the toll on the Golden Gate Bridge, I think, so that maybe would have been a bummer. But when I got to the other side of the bridge, I had no idea where I was going in the city. I was going to stay with a friend, and this guy was just like, "Hey, do you want, like, where are you headed?" Like, and I was like, I told him, and he's like, "Oh, follow me, I'll take you there." So he just like escorted me through the city to my friend's house. So again, it was like another example of just like total strangers being just like super nice to me. But so occasionally, you might find yourself in positions where you have to apologize. And I think on this trip, I used to apologize in like very like gruff tones, right? Like I would try to like deflect the blame to someone else. But every time in this case, I learned very quickly that the best bet for me to do was just to take all blame for my ignorance. Oh, I didn't know that this was like not the way. They would always say like, if I catch you again, I'll write you a ticket. And I knew that I would be out of town, so that was no big deal. But like, you know, but there were certainly like circumstances here that I could like, you know, get out of those situations where I had to apologize for being in a place where I wasn't supposed to be. So not everyone is going to agree with your methods all the time. This was definitely true on my trip, and I heard it from people like relatively frequently. So on my trip, I rode 2 ferries. I rented like 3 or 4 cars to get to places, and every time someone in the process would tell me, they're like, "Oh, well, you're not actually riding your bike around the country. Like, you're on a ferry. Like, you're renting a car. Like, what are you doing?" So there's always going to be like trolls and haters out there or whatever. But I decided that like their opinion of my trip didn't need to affect like my trip in any way, right? And so sometimes I think that's true too on like teams that we're on. Like sometimes, especially in the software world, not everyone likes the way that like everybody else writes code or something like that, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that the way that like you write code needs to be changed to match like someone else's expectations. And they might not always agree with your methods, but if you've got like something that's going to be working at the end of the day, you can stick by your guns there and write your code. Hi, Don.
Sorry, I'm late.
Oh, it's okay. You got your last slide. Oh, just in time. So this is much closer to the actual route that I rode. So, and for a lot of reasons, I decided to like change things up. So I did go through Michigan, Tom Hickman. But so that's one of the ferries that I took. So in that picture, the last picture, that's a ferry at the Badger. So I took that across there. I took the ferry across Lake Champlain. And then I didn't end up going all the way to Seattle because it didn't make sense. I didn't know anybody that lived there, and cities were like the death of my trip anyway. And then I wanted to go through the south of Texas. My parents told me that I had to go visit all my relatives, so I had to go through the north of Texas. So there were things that were like out of my control in some cases that like altered the trip. So I ended up. So the last place that I actually rode my bike was probably the Louisiana-Mississippi border. And I was telling Dre the story earlier. I was there. I was feeling terrible. I was like physically just like totally beat at this. I'm like around like 100 days or so far. And I rode like I was just under 6,000 miles like ridden. And it like this giant storm set in. And this was getting around like fall. This would have been like late October, early November. And so the days were getting shorter. I would have to wait longer in the day to start because the sun would rise and like people would be driving into rush hour traffic, and I didn't want to get murdered. So I would like have to wait. So my total hours of available driving were smaller. So I get to Mississippi-Louisiana border, and the storm sets in, and the local news is like, this road's flooded, avoid this section of town, don't go here. And I'm like, I don't know where any of that stuff is. So, and I was like, I'm so physical, I feel terrible. I'm renting a car. So luckily there was like a regional airport there. So I went to the airport, I rented a car, and I looked at a weather radar map, and I drove to Atlanta because that was outside of the storm. I didn't take into consideration that the wind was blowing that way and the storm was going to follow me to Atlanta. So I get to Atlanta, and I'm staying at my friend's house, and the storm is just like in my rearview mirror the whole day, and it just dumps rain. So I have another day where I'm just sitting there. I'm sitting at my friend's house, and I was just getting like super stiff, and it was like really hard to walk. Like I would get up from the couch to go to the bathroom, and I'd have to like stretch for a long time just to like make the journey to the bathroom. And I thought, man, I'm done with this. Like this trip has like served its purpose. I've had a great adventure. It is over. So I got back in that same rental car, and I drove to Richmond, Virginia, and went home. And Mom's like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "I'm here." So for a long time, not completing the loop, even in this sort of like altered route version, sort of like really bothered me, right? Like I wasn't sure if I like finished it. Should I like go back and finish it? I didn't want to go back and finish it, but like should I do that just to say I completed the loop? And I read a book recently that sort of like really tied this up for me, and like really like over a decade later sort of like gave me peace with this. And the author said that like start lines are better than finish lines, and that really like resonated with me on my trip, because if I had focused the whole time on just this like big giant thing and it had to go exactly the way that I had like planned it, there's no way I would have started, and it would have like been, I wouldn't come away with all these like great experiences. But instead, if I focus on the start line of the whole thing, just getting going and having the experiences that the trip gave me, I come away not feeling like I missed anything because I didn't connect that last section of the loop. I really come away like focusing and thinking that the thing that I did was really unique, something to be proud of, and I like met a multitude of people from around the country that I would never have interacted with otherwise, and really like so I like to think about, as we like start projects and stuff, really focusing on the start lines of those and making sure that we get off the ground, rather than focusing on the absolute picture perfect thing that's like the big picture in our head when we first get started. So that's the last slide.
I'm glad you didn't die.
Thanks. I'm off too. I'll answer questions. I don't know. Do you have questions?
I bet you close it when you're like 85.
What's that?
You'll get on a bike when you're like 85.
And finish it.
Finish it, yeah.
Did your bike break a lot?
Yeah, well, not the bike itself, the spokes did. So there was a section of probably from somewhere around here in Minnesota, I broke a spoke on my rear wheel, and there's no bike shops through this part of the country. There's hardware stores, and there's a guy with a garage, right? And so I would go to these places and would get the spoke replaced, and then it would just break again within a few days. So there was a 450, 500 mile section where every day I would stand behind the bike and I would just spin the wheel to see how wobbly it was. And if it didn't rub the brake, I was like, all right, cool, let's go. And I would just go. And if it did rub the brake, I would just open the brakes more, which meant the brakes were more and more useless every day. And so that continued to happen through all the way. So Walla Walla, Washington is right here. And eventually, I stayed with this really nice lady, and I was like, where can I get, at this point I had 3 broke spokes, I think, on that same rear wheel, and I was like, this thing's just junk, I need to, get a new wheel, I don't need to, just keep putting, spokes in it. And she's like, there's no place. And so I rented a car in Walla Walla, Washington, and drove to Portland, because I was like, there's definitely bike shops in Portland. And I had a friend there anyway, so, I rolled into town, and I went to a bike shop, and this, dude was he's like, are you okay with a custom-built wheel? And I was like, will you guarantee me that I will not break any more spokes? He's like, you'll never break a spoke for this. I will have whatever it is you're selling. Yes. He's like, it'll take me 3 days. I'm like, it's fine. So, yeah. So I did that. Lots of, tubes. I mean, I had, a bunch of flat tires and stuff. There's, a little section right here in Southern California. There's a little town called Plaster City. That's, not a city at all. There's no housing, but there's a plastic plant that's there. And when they drive the trucks in and out of there, just plastic shards just litter the road. And so I got 5 flat tires in a half a mile and ran out of tubes and patch kits. And I was just standing, I was like, I don't know what to do now. I have no way to put air in my tire. And there's a bunch of it's also out in the middle of the big sand dune desert where you see people riding dune buggies. And so these dudes were unloading their dune buggy, and I was like, hey, are you guys headed that way when you're done? And they were very skeptical of me and my tights. And so they were like, yeah, we are. And I was like, you think you could give me a ride? They're like, we're going to be here for hours. I was like, well, I am too. I'm not going anywhere. So, I'll wait. And so they basically were like, yeah, maybe. If you're still here when we get back, maybe. And I was like, oh, that's not comforting, all right. So then I just went like this until some guy who worked for one of the local cities was like, you can't tell anybody that I gave you a ride. And I was like, okay. I don't know what I'm gonna tell, but you're giving me a ride. So then the next little town had a bike shop that I bought 20 tubes at or something, and I needed 2 maybe, but yeah.
You just violated that guy's trust by telling us.
Yeah.
Yep.
I don't remember what city he worked for. I don't think I learned his name, so we're good.
How was your typical day? I mean, how many hours did you drive, and how many breaks you took, and your meals? How do you do that?
Sure. So I set a budget. So I set a budget of $25 a day. So I also raised. So I had some fundraising efforts, and I raised money for the Meals on Wheels in Richmond, Virginia, for this trip. So we ended up donating $8,000 to them or something when it was all done. But I set a budget of $25 a day. But I also needed to buy wheels with this budget, right? So I was way under that. So my so a typical day for me I would ride 2 hours or 30 miles, and I would usually stop for a snack at a gas station or whatever. And literally those 99-cent honey buns and things that they sell, stuff like that was mostly the food that I was eating. So really healthy stuff. Every day not every day, but I bet 95% of the trip, my lunch was at McDonald's for 2 reasons. One, very cheap.
Right.
Everywhere. So it's very consistent. And they have Powerade in the fountain machine, so I didn't have to go buy Gatorade. I could fill my bottles up at the fountain as part of my lunch cost. And then I would sort of repeat that same 2 hours or 30 miles process for some afternoon snack, or oftentimes that would also be where I would get where I was going. So I think my average riding distance per day was somewhere in 80 to 95 miles. My longest day was 135 or something like that. I had a tally sheet. It's in a notebook that I have of like how many days I rode over 100 miles, and it was in like the 20s or something. But really, when all you have is like, especially like middle of summer, you've got like sun up to sundown to cover like 100 miles on your bike. Like you just make your way. It became like pretty. Like I mean, I was pretty fit, but it wasn't like that difficult of a thing to do at that point.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
How did you handle the challenges of going through the southwestern desert area? That seems like
Yeah.
a problematic area.
Yeah. So this area sucked really bad. Going into Phoenix was really bad too. Like going into Phoenix, you actually like have to ride on the interstate. So it's one of the places where like the cops didn't pull me over for riding on the interstate because there's no other roads. So it's obviously like super hot and dry in those places, and so I would just like load up on water whenever I could. There's can you see that? Yeah. So I had like 2 like Nalgene bottles that were empty almost all the trip. And I would just use like bike bottles, but then like when I was in those areas, like I would fill those Nalgenes also, just so I had extra like liquids. And then once I hit Phoenix, I actually went north, like into like northern Arizona, and so that actually turned into like the elevation goes up, and so it gets a lot cooler up there, so that wasn't that bad. And then coming through New Mexico, like New Mexico is like pretty high too, so even it's like high desert, so it wasn't like super hot like Southern California and like going into Phoenix were.
Okay.
So you only put your 10 once.
No, I camped like a dozen times or so. Yeah, I ended up, so I stayed, like all the people from the slide with like their folks, like I ended up, those were all like housing that was arranged like ahead of time before I came into town after like the camping debacle. My mom works from home at the time, and she became like, she's really like the hero of this whole trip. She became like ground control, and she would Google, like I would map out like 7 days, like ideally like these are the towns I'll get to in like 7 days or whatever, and then she would just like Google Meals on Wheels, since I was like, you know, associated with the nonprofit, or like local churches, and so oftentimes like somebody evolved would like take me in, yeah, or let me like camp at like the church property. I didn't, that was the only time that I like road camped at some place where I wasn't supposed to be. All the other times were like someone allowed it, or I was like at a campground. Yeah.
Still have that back tire.
What's up?
Still have that back tire. It'll never go away.
It's on Jill's bike, and it's still operational. Yeah, like I was true to his word. Yeah, yeah, that wheel's still rolling. I have the frame too. It's like all broken down, but I haven't. It's rideable. Like you know, you can put it all together. There was the winter of like 2013 when we got like the record snowfall. I commuted to work every day by bike on that bike in the winter. So yeah, so it's still alright. It's sticky now for some reason. Could probably wash it, but I don't know. I'm not sure why it got sticky.
What? You didn't wash it.
It's a bike. Yeah. They didn't sweat enough. It was like 12 degrees outside all the time. Like, I don't know why it got sticky. Is it road salt or something? I don't know.
What's the item you thought at the beginning is necessary and turned out that you rarely use, and also you abandoned it in the middle of the trip?
Wait, what?
Is there
Sorry.
any what is the item you remember you thought it was necessary from the essential from the beginning,
Yeah.
and then you rarely use it?
Oh. So in that McDonald's parking lot where I was like throwing crap away,
yeah.
I had like a full like range of bike tools that I thought would absolutely be necessary. And so as I was going through those things, I could never part with like all these tools because I thought I would be making like all these like roadside repairs. I didn't need any of that crap. Like I needed like a 5mm hex wrench, and I would have been fine. Like tire levers, like stuff to change flats and do like minor adjustments would have been fine. But like I had like a crank puller that I like dragged around the country for some reason. I didn't need that thing. So there was stuff like that I didn't need. I also had way too many. I say this in every picture that I have. I'm always wearing like the same shirt, but I had other shirts. I don't know why I'm always wearing the same shirt.
Yeah.
But so I took more clothes than I like necessarily needed in terms of like just like casual stuff. Yeah, but there were also times where I like was grossly like underprepared for like cold weather in cases. So going across the like the Rocky Mountains in Glacier National Park, it snowed above 3,000 feet, and I just like didn't have like I got to the top and just like ran into the visitor center and just like sat on a bench like shivering. I think all the tourists were like, okay, because I was just unprepared for that. And then I got caught in a like coming like through like this little section of New Mexico. I got caught in a like hailstorm, and the temperature dropped from like 65, 70 degrees to like below 30 like almost instantly, and I was just getting like dive bombed with hail. There was like no trees or anything to get under, so I was just like every time a car would go by, I would just like stick my thumb out as I like screamed. And like luckily someone pulled over and they had like a trailer, so we just like tossed the bike and I like climbed into like they had one of those like 4-door trucks or whatever, and I like climbed in and they like threw blankets on me, and the little like thermometer in the rearview mirror said like 27, and I was just wearing like shorts and a t-shirt. Like, I was just like shivering to death. So there were times when like I had too many t-shirts and not enough jackets. So yeah. All right.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, guys.
We're going to be sending out a feedback survey to give Landell feedback on his